"Sir, we need your eyes on this document right now." I had not even finished my first cup of coffee on Tuesday morning when my junior compliance analyst, Marcus, came rushing into my office. He was vibrating with nervous energy, holding a fresh printout, his fingers smudging the ink because he was gripping it so hard. In my line of work, panic is a daily commodity, and my job as the senior corporate strategist and lead fixer at Advanced Global Logistics was to keep that panic from reaching the public or the regulators. I took the document from him and scanned the pages. It was a preliminary asset divestiture timeline. Someone in corporate development had mistakenly carbon copied the entire mergers and acquisitions distribution list, including external analysts. If this got out, we would be dealing with a full-blown insider trading investigation and a tanking stock price before the market closed. I told Marcus to tell the IT director to recall the message from the servers immediately, scrub the mail relays, and pull the log files to see exactly who opened it. I wanted a report on my desk in 30 minutes. That was what I did for 8 years. I was the fixer. Whenever the executives at Advanced Global Logistics made a mess, I was the one who cleaned it up, rewrote the risk models, and handled the fallout. I had been hired by the founder and CEO, Howard Vance, when the company was still finding its footing. Howard was 68 years old now, a man who had built his empire on grit but had grown increasingly distant, leaving the day-to-day operations to a board of directors that was slowly filling with opportunists. I had spent nearly a decade playing chess on a board full of jackals, keeping their secrets and protecting the company from its own leadership. By 9:30 a.m. that Tuesday, I had neutralized the email leak, updated the security protocols on our external servers, and sent out a routine IT test message to cover up the system-wide email recall. The crisis was solved before the board members even realized they were in danger. The chief financial officer had once called me the most valuable asset the company never advertised, which was high praise coming from a man who once tried to expense a private helicopter ride as a team-building exercise. I walked back to my desk, sat down, and finally opened my email. That was when I noticed the first crack in the foundation. My weekly alignment meeting with Howard Vance, which had been on my calendar for the last 312 consecutive Mondays, was gone. It had not been rescheduled, it had simply been deleted from the system. No cancellation note, no explanation. I checked the invite list for the upcoming quarterly logistics review on Thursday. My name was missing. The calendar system did not show me as declined, it showed me as completely removed, as if I had never been part of the strategic planning group. I sat very still. In my 54 years of life, I had learned to spot a corporate execution long before HR actually printed the paperwork. I did not panic. I opened my system access log and checked my permissions. The back-end database directories and the compliance logs were still there, but my administrative privileges had been silently downgraded on 3 key folders containing our historical operating agreements. Someone was pulling my access while I was still busy cleaning up their latest operational disaster. I knew exactly where this was coming from. 2 months ago, Howard Vance had promoted his 34-year-old son, Jared Vance, to vice president of operations. Jared was a young man with an expensive MBA, a massive ego, and a complete lack of operational experience. He had spent the last 2 months talking about flattening organizational structures, optimizing legacy resources, and driving cross-functional synergy. In reality, Jared was looking to clear out the old guard, the people who actually knew how the company ran, so he could populate the executive suite with his own friends. He viewed my 8 years of tenure not as a strategic asset, but as an obstacle to his authority. He wanted to be the visionary leader, and he could not do that with a fixer in the room who remembered every mistake he and his father had ever made. I knew the signs of a soft betrayal. It always starts with deleted calendar invites, whispered meetings, and a sudden interest in documenting your daily tasks. They wanted to make me redundant, but what Jared Vance did not realize was that I had spent 8 years writing the company's internal regulations, and I knew every backdoor in the corporate registry. I left the office at 3:30 p.m. that day, carrying nothing but my keys. I drove home, poured a glass of water, and opened my private encrypted offline archive. I scrolled down to a folder titled LLC Operating Agreement 6A, dated 6 years ago, and began to read. We handled shipping corridors and supply chain logistics across 3 continents, coordinating with customs departments and port authorities day in and day out. It was a massive network of databases and compliance structures that kept the cargo moving. The divestiture document Marcus showed me was the roadmap for selling off our West Coast distribution hubs, a transaction that had not yet been disclosed to the public. If a partner leaked this, it would violate federal security laws, triggering a direct enforcement action under 17 U.S.C. Section 106. I spent 8 years designing the firewalls and protocol layers that kept these filings secure. I had established the compliance templates and drafted the risk management policies that protected the company from the board's constant eagerness to cut corners. Howard Vance had hired me because he knew he was out of his depth. He was a shipping veteran who knew how to manage captains, but he did not know how to handle venture capitalists and digital regulatory oversight. I was his shield. For nearly a decade, I kept the regulators happy and the class action lawyers at bay. Jared did not understand this history. To him, Vance Global Logistics was just a stepping stone for his own career, a company that needed to be modernized by replacing its most experienced staff with consultants. I had watched them do it to the Legacy Logistics director last year, and they thought they could use the same playbook on me. But I was the architect of their legal structure. Every operating agreement and trust deed had passed through my hands. I knew the vulnerabilities of their corporate structure, because I'd spent 8 years patching them. As I drove home that Tuesday, I was not angry. I was simply preparing. On Wednesday morning, the trap was sprung. I had barely stepped through the glass doors of the headquarters when I received an urgent page from Sandra Foley, the HR director. She wanted me in the third-floor conference room immediately. When I walked in, I found Jared Vance already seated at the glass table, looking smug in a tailored suit that was a bit too tight for him. Sandra was sitting next to him, her fingers nervously drumming on a folder. I did not sit down. I stood by the door keeping my coat on and looked at them. Jared cleared his throat, adjusting his watch. "Charles, thank you for coming," he began, his voice carrying that rehearsed, corporate cadence. "We will keep this brief. After a strategic review of our operational needs, we have decided that your role as senior strategist has been dissolved. We are flattening our corporate structure, and legacy advisory positions are no longer aligned with our Q3 objectives. The termination is effective immediately." Sandra Foley slid a thick manila envelope across the polished glass table. "The paperwork was finalized yesterday," she said, her voice flat and retroactively defensive. "You will find the details of your severance package inside. We have already deactivated your company credit cards and your server access. A security guard is currently packing up your desk and we will escort you out of the building." I looked at the envelope, then at Jared. "You are firing me," I said. It was not a question. It was just a statement of fact. Jared smiled, a thin, oily expression. "It is not personal, Charles. It is just business. We need to look to the future." I did not argue. I did not plead. I did not explain why removing the only person who understood the company's regulatory compliance framework was a catastrophic mistake. That would have made it personal, and I am a professional. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my own fountain pen. It was a vintage writing instrument filled with a specific, pressure-sensitive blue ink. Sandra looked surprised when I sat down and opened the packet. "We have pens, Charles," she said, sliding one toward me. "I will use my own," I replied. I turned to the acknowledgement page. I did not sign the non-compete clause, and I did not sign the liability waiver. I only signed the document verifying that I had been notified of my retroactive termination on this date. The ink from my pen was special, registered 3 years ago in the company's security database during a fraud prevention audit. The pressure profile and the chemical composition of the ink were logged and time-stamped, creating an immutable cryptographic signature tied to the company's internal archive. I finished signing, recapped my pen, and stood up. Jared looked almost disappointed that I had not made a scene. He had probably spent the last week practicing how he would handle an angry employee. He wanted a fight, but I only gave him silence. I picked up the envelope, walked out of the conference room, and took the stairs to avoid the security guard waiting by the elevator. I walked out of the building into the hot midday sun. I drove back to my house, sat at my kitchen table, and opened my laptop. My corporate account was already locked. My email was gone, and my Slack access had been deactivated. But my private server was still running, and the cryptographic verification from my fountain pen signature had already logged the event. The timestamp was 9:44 a.m. on Wednesday. I opened the encrypted archive of the company's original operating agreement. Under the Delaware LLC Act, specifically Section 18 of 304, the rules of a company are governed by its operating agreement. 6 years ago, when the company went through a major merger, I had drafted the contingency clauses myself. I had inserted Clause 14.6c. The clause stated that any retroactive involuntary termination of a key partner linked to familial restructuring or executive reorganization would trigger a full redemption and buyout of the executive equity trust. The trigger was specific. The firing had to be initiated by an executive with direct familial ties to the CEO. It had to be retroactive. And it had to be verified by a time-stamped signature. Jared Vance had just fulfilled every single one of those conditions. The HR conference room on the third floor was designed to feel intimidating. It was a minimalist box with glass walls, designed so that anyone walking down the corridor could see you being terminated. Sandra Foley looked particularly uncomfortable. She had been with the company for 4 years, and she knew that I had saved her department from a major class action lawsuit regarding overtime compensation just 18 months ago. Now, she was acting as Jared's executioner, unable to look me in the eye. Jared sat at the head of the table, turning his phone over and over, waiting to deliver the speech he had undoubtedly rehearsed. When Sandra slid the envelope, I could see the documents. The severance agreement offered 6 months of base salary in exchange for a complete release of all claims, a strict non-compete clause, and a non-disclosure agreement. Jared's voice was smooth, carrying the hollow confidence of someone who had never had to deal with the real-world consequences of his decisions. "We are moving in a different direction, Charles," he said, leaning back. "We feel that your strategic approach is too focused on legacy systems." It was corporate speak that meant absolutely nothing. I did not point out that our legacy systems were the only reason we were currently passing audits. I signed the form, establishing the exact moment of my retroactive termination. Jared did not know that the compliance server was already routing the transaction to our external archiving partner. They had deactivated my badge and cut my access, believing they had rendered me powerless. It is a common mistake made by young executives who confuse IT permissions with actual legal authority. And then on Thursday morning, I drove to the storage facility on the outskirts of the city. The air inside smelled of concrete, old paper, and dust. I walked down the long corridor to Unit 209, a 10 by 10 space where I kept the physical files I had accumulated over my 8 years at the company. I keyed in the passcode and rolled up the metal door. Inside, behind a stack of old monitors and boxes of historical audit logs, sat a fireproof filing cabinet. I opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a heavy leather folder containing the original physical copies of the LLC operating agreement and the equity trust deeds. These were the documents that Howard Vance and the original board members had signed 6 years ago during the merger. They had been so focused on the immediate payout and the press releases that they had barely glanced at the operational appendices. I flipped to Clause 14.6c. The language was clear, precise, and legally binding under Delaware corporate law. It was designed as a shield against nepotism, ensuring that if Howard ever tried to push out the legacy partners to install his own family, the legacy partners could force an immediate buyout of the equity pool at a predetermined valuation. The valuation was not a cash payout. According to the Delaware LLC Act, Section 18502, the operating agreement can specify the terms of capital contributions and distributions. Under Clause 14.6c, the buyout was structured as a debt-for-equity swap. The moment the trigger event was verified, the administrative control of the Executive Equity Trust, which held 72% of the company's voting shares, would automatically transfer to the terminated partner. The executives had signed this agreement because they believed I would never be in a position to enforce it, or because they had simply forgotten it existed. I took the physical documents, locked the storage unit, and drove to the office of my attorney, Donald Caldwell. Donald was a veteran corporate lawyer who worked out of a quiet office. He was a man who did not care about corporate buzzwords. He only cared about the exact wording of the law. I laid the folder on his desk and explained the situation. Donald Caldwell put on his reading glasses and read through Clause 14.6c twice. He then looked at the notarized signature page and the cryptographic verification log from my fountain pen. "This is tight, Charles," he said, his voice quiet. "Under Delaware law, an operating agreement is a contract, and the courts enforce them strictly. The retroactive termination paper you signed yesterday is the final piece of the puzzle." Jared Vance signed it as Vice President of Operations, which establishes his familial link and authority. The fact that they backdated the decision to Tuesday makes it a retroactive termination under the terms of the clause. Donald called in his assistant, who was a registered notary. We went through the documents page by page, verifying the original signatures, the timestamps, and the ink profile. The notary stamped the physical copies, logging the transaction in the state registry at 11:30 a.m. I now had 3 notarized and certified copies of the execution packet. One copy would remain with Donald Caldwell. The second copy would be filed with the Delaware State Corporate Registry. The third copy would be sent directly to the Board of Directors during their meeting on Friday. Under the terms of the agreement, the transfer of administrative control was automatic and did not require a court order. The executives had 24 hours from the time of notification to dispute the trigger, but under Section 14.6c, any dispute could only be initiated before the termination took effect. Since they had already fired me and deactivated my access, the window for them to file a challenge had closed. They had locked themselves out of their own house, and they did not even know it yet. I thanked Donald, took the files, and drove home to prepare the final payload. Executives love digital archives because they are easy to delete or modify when a transaction goes bad. I kept physical copies because paper does not have a version history that can be altered by a system administrator. The metal cabinet was heavy, the drawers groaning as I pulled them open. I found the folder marked M&A Appendix 6A, were the original wet ink signatures of Howard Vance, the original board members, and the legacy partners. This was the document that governed the company's capital structure. Clause 14.6c was buried on page 87 under a section titled Restructuring and Reorganization Covenants. It was drafted during the peak of the merger negotiations, a time when Howard was paranoid about a hostile buyout and wanted a poison pill that would protect his control. He had not realized that the poison pill was structured to protect the legacy partners, not just him. Under the Delaware LLC Act, the members of an LLC have wide latitude in drafting their operating agreements. By firing me and assigning my duties to Jared's operations group, they had activated the redemption clause. The trust assets would automatically transfer to my administrative control, giving me the authority to vote those shares. Donald Caldwell confirmed this. "The backdating is their undoing," Donald said. "They dated the termination as Tuesday, but they did not notify you until Wednesday morning. That establishes the retroactive nature of the firing. We spent 2 hours preparing the formal execution packet. The Delaware Registry was updated at 11:30 a.m. Thursday, establishing the legal transfer of the trust assets on the state level. Friday morning arrived, cold and overcast. The Board of Directors was scheduled to meet at 1 p.m. in room 17B to review the Q3 organizational changes and approve Jared Vance's new operational structure. I spent the morning verifying the routing logic of my encrypted legal payload. I had set up an automated delivery system through the company's internal compliance queue. Because I had designed the compliance system, I knew it bypassed the standard IT spam filters and landed directly on the main boardroom screen whenever an urgent regulatory notice was received. The payload was scheduled to execute at exactly 1 p.m., just as the meeting was starting. At 12:30 p.m., I drove to the headquarters. I parked my car in my usual spot on the 3rd level of the parking deck, next to the concrete pillar. I walked toward the main entrance, wearing my best suit. The security guard at the desk looked up, his face turning pale when he saw me. "Mr. Mercer," he said, half rising, "your badge has been deactivated. I looked him in the eye and spoke calmly. "I am here for the board meeting," I said. "Room 17B. He looked at his screen, then back at me. His hand hovered over his radio. I did not wait for him to make a decision. I walked past the gate and took the elevator to the executive floor. When I opened the door to room 17B, the room went quiet. The board members were already seated around the long table. Jared Vance was standing at the front of the room, holding a clicker, ready to start his presentation. Howard Vance was sitting at the head of the table, looking tired. General Counsel was seated at the far end, reviewing some papers. Jared's face flushed with anger when he saw me. "Charles, what are you doing here?" he demanded. "You are no longer an employee of this company. Security has been notified." I walked to the empty chair at the end of the table and sat down. "I am still on the corporate registry as a trust administrator," I said, keeping my voice level. "And under the Delaware LLC Act, I have a right to attend any meeting regarding the restructuring of the equity pool." Jared turned to Howard. "Dad, tell him to leave." Howard looked at me, then at his son, but he did not say anything. He looked tired, as if the weight of the company was finally catching up to him. Jared cleared his throat and clicked his remote. The projector screen showed the first slide, Vance Global Logistics Q3 Operational Realignment. I looked at my watch. It was 12:58 p.m. Jared began to speak, his voice filled with the standard jargon about efficiency and cost reduction. He talked about phasing out legacy advisory roles to save $350,000 in annual overhead. He was referring to my salary. I did not look at the screen. I looked at the board members. The CFO looked uncomfortable. The board chair was taking notes. 12:59 p.m. My phone vibrated once in my pocket. The automated delivery system had just initiated the transmission. I sat back, folded my hands, and waited for the quietest explosion in the company's history. At exactly 1 p.m., a chime sounded from the general counsel's laptop. It was the clinical, high-priority alert reserved for regulatory filings. Almost immediately, the presentation slide on the main boardroom screen disappeared. It was replaced by a red compliance window displaying a sealed PDF document. The header of the document was bold and unmistakable. "Urgent DNC 14 regulatory notification." General Counsel leaned forward, his eyes widening as he read the preview text. "What is this?" Howard Vance asked, squinting at the screen. "Why is the presentation gone?" Jared clicked his remote frantically, but the screen did not change. The compliance system had locked the display, preventing any override until the notification was acknowledged. General Counsel stood up, his face turning gray. "Howard, we need to read this right now," he said. The company's compliance alert system was a tool I had built 4 years ago during a federal audit. It was designed to bypass all internal network firewalls and display urgent regulatory notices on all active executive screens, including the main boardroom projector. It was an emergency system, meant to notify the board of an immediate regulatory shutdown or an SEC enforcement action. Because it was a compliance tool, it was hard-coded into the network architecture, and the IT department did not have the permissions to override it without my administrative key. I loaded the PDF of the notarized redemption packet into the payload, verified the routing logic, and set the timer. When I arrived at the headquarters, the atmosphere was sterile and familiar. The glass lobby was filled with the usual hum of employees, completely unaware of the boardroom battle. The security guard, Ryan, whom I had known for 3 years, looked genuinely distressed when he saw me. He knew I had been escorted out on Wednesday, and his screen showed my badge as deactivated. I simply unlocked my phone, showed him the state registry confirmation of my status as trust administrator, and walked past. Room 17B was the primary executive boardroom. When I walked in, the board members were already reviewing Jared's presentation. Jared's face went white. "Charles, this is a private board meeting," he said. I sat down, looking at Howard. General Counsel looked up, his expression suddenly cautious. He knew about the trust. Jared clicked his remote, trying to ignore my presence, and began his presentation. I watched the clock on the wall. 1 p.m. The compliance system alert chime sounded, and the slide disappeared from the screen, replaced by the PDF. And General Counsel began to read the document, his voice trembling slightly. Clause 14.6c Activation Notice. Involuntary retroactive termination of Charles Mercer. Verified by cryptographic signature. Equity trust redemption initiated under Section 18304 of the Delaware LLC Act. The room fell into a dead silence. Jared Vance stared at the screen, his mouth open. "What is this garbage?" he stammered. "This is some old document Charles drafted years ago. It is not valid." General Counsel looked at him, then at Howard. "It is valid, Jared," he said, his voice flat. "It is signed by Howard, witnessed by the original board, and notarized. The state corporate registry has already logged the filing. The equity transfer is complete." Howard Vance leaned forward, his hands flat on the table. "Charles, what did you do?" he asked. "I did not do anything, Howard," I replied. "Your son fired me on Wednesday, retroactively backdated to Tuesday. In doing so, he triggered Clause 14.6c of the operating agreement that you signed 6 years ago. The clause was designed to protect the company from nepotism and hostile restructuring. It states that if a legacy partner is fired as part of a familial reorganization, the administrative control of the executive equity trust immediately transfers to that partner." Jared's public email on Tuesday morning about restructuring legacy roles served as the perfect evidence of the trigger. Under the Delaware LLC Act, the agreement is binding and irrevocable. Jared stood up, shouting, "This is fraud. We will challenge this in court. We will freeze the shares." General Counsel shook his head. "We cannot, Jared. The clause specifies that any challenge must be filed before the termination takes effect. By backdating the paperwork and deactivating Charles's access immediately, you missed the window. The transfer of control is already registered with the SEC and the state of Delaware. Charles Mercer now controls 72% of the voting shares of this company." The board chair looked at me, her expression neutral. "Charles, what are your intentions?" she asked. "My intention is to restore the operational integrity of this company," I said. "I am replacing Jared Vance as Vice President of Operations, effective immediately, and I am initiating a full audit of all executive compensation packages to align them with actual performance, not familial ties." Howard Vance stared at me, his face twitching with a mixture of anger and defeat. His eye had a small, involuntary tick. He looked like a man who had realized his entire legacy had been dismantled by the very person he had hired to protect it. Jared sank back into his chair, his face pale and sweaty. He had thought he was the visionary leader playing chess, but he had just walked directly into a checkmate. I stood up and walked to the head of the table. I took my old company badge from my pocket and placed it on the glass table in front of Jared. "You can keep this," I said. "I do not need it anymore." I turned and walked toward the door. Nobody tried to stop me. General Counsel was already on his phone, calling the compliance team to update the registry. The CFO was looking at the new equity distribution table, and the board chair was reviewing the audit requirements. The system had processed the change, and the company's servers were already updating my access to administrator level. I walked out of room 17B, took the elevator down to the lobby, and walked out into the cool afternoon air. I had spent 8 years fixing their mistakes, protecting them from their own greed and incompetence. Now, I did not have to fix their company anymore. I owned it. Under Delaware corporate law, a contract is a contract, and the fine print always wins. As I got into my car and drove away, I knew that the quietest moves are always the most powerful. The General Counsel opened the PDF and began to read the clauses. The board members stared at the screen, then at Howard, then at me. Jared's face had gone pasty white. General Counsel looked at him, his expression filled with professional dread. "Jared, he did this through the state registry yesterday morning," he said. "The signature is Howard's. The equity transfer is already processed." Jared turned to Howard, his voice rising. "Dad, tell him the agreement is void." General Counsel shook his head. "We cannot file an injunction. You backdated the termination, but you did not notify him until Wednesday morning. By the time you notified him, the state registry had already logged the redemption. You locked the doors from the inside and handed him the keys. The Executive Equity Trust holds 72% of the voting shares. Charles Mercer is now the controlling shareholder." The board chair slowly closed her notebook. She looked at me, her expression calm. "Charles, what is your next move?" she asked. I stood up, walked to the head of the table, and looked at Jared. "My first move is to replace Jared Vance as Vice President of Operations. He does not have the experience or the legal understanding. My second move is to initiate a forensic audit. Howard Vance looked at me, his face twitching. Jared sank into his chair, his hands covering his face. I placed my old badge on the table, turned, and walked out. I had spent 8 years fixing their mistakes. Now, I did not have to fix their company anymore. I owned it.